You mentioned how um, once you were into the podcast, you eventually changed the conversation from a abstract political one to a more personal one. Um, Listening to them again, I get the sense that you were there was a lot less necessary confidence in the way you were positioning the arguments, or not necessarily confidence, but confidence in the listeners to stick with you through that conversation. Whereas the more recent, well, from then onwards, you're quite verbose, shall I say, and confident in the manner of when you come out with, you don't hold any punches, so to speak. Do you feel that's a fair comment, or have I misread that?
Well, if I understand you correctly, and I didn't just start talking out of my armpit, so to speak, driving, I did have some idea of where it is I wanted to take the conversation
Sure.
at which it had to go. I mean, I think that your observation is very astute, and I would say that it's a lot easier to get people's agreement on abstract philosophical principles than it is on personal relationships, particularly core ones or foundational ones like family relationships. So I needed to start talking about gods and governments, because if I'd started off about family, then I wouldn't have gotten anywhere with anyone, right? But the hook, I guess there's a hook, right? And the bait on the hook is, hey, let's talk philosophy, let's talk the state, let's talk about God, and so on, and let's talk about abstract power structures, and let's work out a philosophical approach that is logical and consistent with those abstract power structures. And people love to come along with that because it's interesting, it's thrilling, it's exciting, it gives you great debating points, it wakens up your brain and so on. And I needed to get people's confidence or trust that I had something useful to offer, something of consistency and rigor to offer in those areas, to get them swept up, to get them excited, to stimulate their minds and so on. I needed to do all of that and to get people swept up in the thrill of abstract philosophy. And then, when they're on board and we're out of sight of land, and then I can say where we're really going, which is we're not sailing into an abstract world of futuristic societies with DROs and private defense agencies and so on. What we're sailing towards is your family and your life and your friends. We're not sailing into an abstract future that you can only guess at and talk about and theorize. And the real question here is not whether there will be vending machines with cocaine in a free society in 200 years. The real question is, if these are your values, what are you going to do about your relationship where you really have control and power? If we're going to ask people to give up the state, but we won't give up our friends, if we're going to ask people to give up their subsidies, like the farmers or the military, if we're going to ask people to give up their subsidies, but we hang around corrupt parents because they're paying for our university, that's just hypocrisy. And nobody's going to take that at all seriously. And then you might as well not do it, right? And that's what I keep saying to people. If you're going to go philosophy, go the whole hog. Do it all, right? Because don't get stuck in the middle, right? Stuck in the middle where you have values that are different from anyone else, and you don't even get the pleasures of conformity, and those pleasures are not inconsiderable, in the same way that the pleasures of cocaine or heroin are not inconsiderable. But don't get stuck in the middle, right? Live the values or drop the values, but don't just have the values and then just use them to keep people at bay and then defer decisions and then hang around corrupt people but still have these values and get into arguments all the time but never get free and find better companions. And I mean, that to me is a real torture. That's real hell. And so that's really the focus that I'm trying to make. So I think you're right. The beginning, I talked about abstract things, and then I slowly began to turn the searchlight, which we thought was pointing into the future, and pointed into the heart and soul of everybody's relationships who was listening, and that's where the volatility began.